It began as nothing more than a toddler playing the dirt. Tiny hands, a plastic shovel, and an odd fixation on the same patch of ground. At first, his parents laughed it off. But when the digging wouldn't stop and when neighbors' dogs and even the soil itself seemed to change, the truth became impossible to ignore. What he uncovered was not just an object, but a century-old secret that adults had missed for generations. How did a child barely able to speak know where to dig? And why did he stop the moment the mystery was revealed? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The backyard was not remarkable. It was a kind of small fenced patch of grass that stretched behind countless homes across the suburbs, a rectangle of mowed green with a swing set pushed to one side and a faded plastic slide standing awkwardly against the fence. But for reasons his parents could not explain, their 2-year-old son never seemed interested in the toys they had set out for him. Day after day, he wandered past the swing, past the bright slide, and settled instead at the far end of the yard, where the grass grew patchier and the soil showed through. There, in the same spot no larger than a doormat, he crouched low with his plastic shovel and began to dig. At first it was charming. His mother laughed when she saw the little boy bend over, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth as he scraped at the dirt with focused determination. She told herself it was the kind of harmless play every child goes through. The father agreed, joking that their son was training early to be a gardener. They thought it would pass in a week, like the other fleeting obsessions toddlers were known for. But the digging did not stop. Every morning, as soon as he was let into the yard, he went straight to the spot. He did not wander or play first. He made a beeline for that patch of earth, ignoring his toys, ignoring even the family dog that barked for his attention. His small shovel cut into ground again and again. When his parents tried to distract him, he cried with a frustration that felt out of proportion for his age. The persistence became difficult to dismiss. His mother began to notice that no matter how much soil she brushed back into the shallow hole at night, smoothing it over before bedtime, by the next morning it looked disturbed again, as though something had shifted from beneath. The child returned to it without hesitation, as if he could sense the exact place even when she tried covering it more carefully. Neighbors began to notice. The family next door, peering over the fence one afternoon, remarked jokingly that the little boy must be digging his way to China. The father laughed politely, but the words carried a weight that unsettled him later that night. Their son was too young to understand the humor, too young to explain why he was doing it. And yet there he was, day after day, in the same patch of ground, his tiny fingers sifting through dirt with unwavering focus. There was something strange about the silence. Toddlers usually filled their play with chatter, nonsense words, or bursts of laughter. But here, crouched in the dirt, the boy said nothing. He dug quietly, methodically, and when he found a small stone or fragment of root, he would set it aside neatly, then continue. His parents tried to ask him what he was doing, but he gave no clear answer. He was too young to explain, only repeating, "Dig, dig," as though that alone was enough. One evening, as the sun set behind a row of houses, his mother watched from the kitchen window while washing dishes. She noticed the way he sat back on his heels, staring at the disturbed soil with a look she struggled to describe. It wasn't joy. It wasn't boredom. It was something closer to expectation, as though he were waiting for something to surface. She told herself not to make too much of it, but unease crept in. Children were supposed to wander in their play, to invent new games from one day to the next. But her son seemed bound to this patch of earth as though tethered by an unseen string. When she carried him inside, he twisted in her arms to look back over her shoulder, watching the spot until it was out of sight. The father remained skeptical. He insisted it was just a phase, something that would fade as quickly as it came. But privately, even he found himself watching the boy more carefully. He could not ignore the determined way the small hands pressed into dirt, or how the child returned to it after every distraction. Something about the consistency gnawed at him. The sense that this was not random play but a kind of task, one the boy himself could not put into words. In the weeks that followed, the hole grew wider, though never very deep. Each time the soil collapsed inward, the boy began again, scooping with his shovel, sometimes even with his bare hands. The ground looked darker there, richer, as though different from the rest of the yard. And though the parents told themselves it was nothing more than coincidence, they found it harder each day to laugh it off. By the end of the month, what had begun as a small curiosity had become a presence in their lives. Friends asked why the boy always came in with dirt under his fingernails. Family members noticed the patches on his jeans worn through at the knees. The parents smiled, made excuses, and tried to treat it lightly. But at night, when the house was quiet, they admitted to each other that they no longer knew what to think. Their son had chosen a place in the earth, and he would not let it go. The days began to take on a rhythm that unsettled the household. Morning light crept through the curtains, the coffee machine sputtered in the kitchen, and before either parent had properly woken, their son was at the back door pointing toward the yard. He did not fuss for breakfast, nor reach for toys. He simply went outside, and when the door opened, he ran with the kind of urgency most children reserve for playgrounds or favorite games. His small legs carried him directly to the patch of soil at the far end of the lawn, and with practiced ease, he dropped his knees and began the familiar routine. At first, the parents found oddly comforting. There was no tantrum to start the day, no wandering into danger. He was absorbed in his digging, and that gave him time to prepare for work, to pack lunches, to go through the motions of their mornings. But comfort gave way to unease when they realized just how relentless the pattern had become. He did not tire of it, did not exchange the shovel for toys, did not invent new games. Each day was a mirror of the one before. The neighbors noticed, too, over the fence. Mrs. Klein remarked with half a smile that the boy seemed destined to be a construction worker. She laughed, but her eyes lingered on the small dirt crater that grew wider each week. On the other side, the Johnsons began asking whether the parents were planting a garden. Their teenage son joked that maybe the toddler was searching for buried treasure. The parents laughed along, but laughter came easier in the company of others. Alone, it felt thin and strained. The patch of soil itself became different from the rest of the yard. The grass had stopped growing there, replaced by loose, dark earth churned daily by small hands and plastic tools. The dog avoided it, circling wide as if wary of the disturbed ground. Birds picked at the edges but never landed in the middle. Even the parents began to step around it without thinking, leaving it to their son as if it were his private territory. Weeks passed, and the child's obsession showed no sign of fading. The mother tried covering the spot at night with fresh soil, even transplanting small squares of sod from other parts of the yard. By morning, the new covering was clawed through, tossed aside as though her son had never paused in his work. It was as if he recognized the exact place no matter what disguise she placed over it. She told herself it was coincidence, but her confidence eroded with each attempt. The father remained outwardly dismissive, but he too began to feel the strangeness press in. Coming home from work, he would glance out the window before greeting his son, almost expecting to see the small figure crouched in the dirt even after nightfall. Sometimes he did. There were evenings when the boy slipped outside unnoticed, standing barefoot in the cool grass, shovel in hand, scraping at the soil by moonlight. They carried him back inside, but he always cried, pointing toward the patch until exhaustion finally quieted him. Conversations between the parents grew strained. The mother worried openly, asking whether they should consult someone, a pediatrician or a child behavior specialist. The father argued it was harmless, a phase, something that would fade as quickly as it came. But in the stillness of night, when the house was dark, both admitted silently to themselves that they no longer believed it was simple play. By now, the neighbors had grown uneasy, too. Passing comments became whisper exchanges. A child's game was one thing, but weeks of it, always the same spot, always the same determined silence, felt different. Children were supposed to be distracted easily, moving from one curiosity to the next. But this boy did not move on. He stayed. He dug. The parents began to wonder if the obsession was connected to something beneath the soil, something unseen. They found themselves studying the patch with new eyes, looking for clues. The mother pressed her hand to the earth once when her son wasn't watching, startled at how cool and damp it felt compared to the rest of the yard. The father drove a spade into ground one Saturday, intending to dig deeper, but stopped after only a few inches. He told himself it was nothing, Yet the weight in his chest remained as though he had almost uncovered something he was not meant to see. The weeks blurred together. The mornings began not with sunlight or coffee, but with a scrape of plastic against soil, steady and repetitive, the sound of small hands pursuing something only he seemed to understand. The boy never explained, never offered more than his quiet insistence. Dig, always dig. And as each day passed, the patch of earth refused to be forgotten, drawing not only the attention of neighbors, but the uneasy awareness of a family who no longer knew if they were watching a child at play or something else entirely. The house did not look old at first glance. White siding covered much of its original frame, the kind of vinyl improvements common in mid-century renovations. A porch had been rebuilt in the 1970s, and the windows were replaced sometime after that with cheaper aluminum frames. From the street, it resembled dozens of other modest homes scattered across the neighborhood. But beneath the layers of repair and disguise, its bones carried the shape of another era. The foundation, poured thick and gray, was set deeper than modern houses. The roof line had a sharp pitch, more Gothic than suburban, and the basement stretched further under the yard than any blueprint now admitted. It was in this house that the boys' parents began to wonder about what had come before them. The patch of disturbed earth had forced their attention outward, but in the quiet evenings, when they searched for answers, they turned inward to the property's past. Old neighbors spoke with the kind of careful distance reserved for unpleasant history. Some remembered that the lot had once belonged to a family who kept to themselves. Others recalled stories of disputes, whispered feuds with adjoining landowners, arguments that grew violent in ways official records never fully captured. At the county archive, tucked between shelves of brittle deeds and yellowing maps, the mother found a reference to the original construction date, 1924. The permit listed the owner as Charles Haldane, a man whose name appeared in several newspaper clippings from that decade. He was described as a merchant, though what he sold was never clearly specified. Local memory remembered him less for his trade and more for his silence. Haldane rarely appeared in public. His family rarely mingled with the neighbors, and by the late 1930s, their presence seemed to vanish without announcement. The records that remained hinted at shadows rather than clarity. A series of property disputes appeared across multiple years, each centered on the boundary between the Haldane lot and the farmland that once pressed against its edge. Survey maps contradicted one another, lines drawn in pencil shifting slightly from one decade to the next. Neighbors accused Haldane of encroachment, of building fences a few feet too far, of claiming soil that was not his. The disputes grew bitter enough that one case reached the county court. Yet the resolution was never filed. Instead, the paperwork stopped abruptly as though abandoned. There were other entries, smaller notices that spoke of unease. Deaths listed in the family register that did not appear in the local cemetery records. A brief obituary for a child, unnamed, described only as lost in an accident. Another clipping noted that the family may have died suddenly in the home, though no cause was printed. Each detail by itself could have been explained away by the limitations of the time. Together, they suggest a household where tragedies stacked one upon another, quietly, until memory itself turned from them. The parents found themselves unsettled by these fragments. They had bought the house for its affordability, not its history. It was meant to be a fresh start after years of struggle, a place to raise their child with stability. But the deeper they looked, the less the house seemed like a clean slate, and the more it resembled a canvas layered with hidden strokes. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow in the basement corner, felt heavier when considered against the backdrop of sudden disappearances and unmarked deaths. The mother could not forget the faces in the single surviving photograph she found in an online archive, a grainy black and white image of the Haldane family on the porch shortly after the house was completed. Charles stood stiff in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Beside him, his wife stared directly at the camera with eyes that seemed both defiant and wary. Two children sat at their feet, blurred slightly by the camera's long exposure, their features difficult to discern. No names accompanied the photo. No further pictures of the family ever appeared. Rumors clung to property even as decades passed. Some said the family had fled during the Depression, abandoning debts they could not pay. Others whispered of darker ends, of violence concealed, of something buried that neighbors chose not to speak of openly. By the 1950s, the house had changed hands quietly, sold at below market price, and its new occupants avoided discussion of its past. Each family that lived there stayed only a few years before moving on. The neighbors grew accustomed to the turnover, treating the house as a place that never quite settled, a structure that resisted permanence. For the parents, learning this history did not provide answers so much as deepen the questions surrounding their son's fixation. The spot he dug at lay near the property's edge, precisely where boundary disputes had once been fought. The soil there was darker, heavier, unlike the rest of the yard. They wondered if fences had been moved, if something had been hidden or forgotten in the process. Each morning, when their child bent down to scoop at the earth with a small shovel, they could not help but imagine the shadows of the past pressing close, guiding his small hands towards something they themselves could not yet see. She had told herself it was only a phase, the kind of curious fixation that toddlers often slip into and then abandon as suddenly as they begin. But as the weeks passed, doubt grew heavier on her shoulders. Each night after her son was asleep, she walked to the back door, sliding it open quietly so as not to wake him. The yard was silent under the wash of porch light. The patch of soil, the same patch her son returned each day, waited at the far end like a wound on the lawn. She would carry a small garden rake, smoothing the disturbed dirt into a level surface, pressing it down as firmly as she could. Sometimes she even scattered grass seed across it, trying to erase the marks of his digging. Yet by morning, without fail, the earth looked unsettled once more, ridges and depressions showing where it had shifted. It was not just her son's work. The patterns were different, sometimes pressed up from beneath rather than scraped away from above. At first she kept this to herself, unwilling to feed the unease she already sensed in her husband. He laughed too easily at their son's determination, treating it as little more than a story to tell at family gatherings. She did not want to contradict him, but she found herself watching the patch each morning through the kitchen window, coffee cooling untouched in her hands. The boy bent low again, his fingers sinking into soil that seemed to pull at him as much as he pressed into it. There were nights when she could not sleep. She would wake in the small hours, heart pounding for no reason she could explain. Slipping from bed, she padded barefoot to the window and drew the curtain. The yard lay in darkness, yet her eyes always found the same corner. Once, she thought she saw movement there, as though the ground itself shivered. Another time, she was sure she heard a faint scraping, not sharp like her son's plastic shovel, but duller, slower, as if wood or bone had shifted beneath the earth. She told herself it was imagination, the mind turning shadows into shapes. Still, the doubt lingered. Her son began to change as well. When he played in the dirt, he no longer babbled or laughed the way toddlers usually do. He grew quieter, more focused, as though listening to something beneath him. Sometimes he paused with his head tilted, his small hand resting flat on the ground. Then he would resume, digging with renewed determination. She tried coaxing him away with toys, snacks, even promises of a walk to the park, but he resisted with cries that felt sharper, more desperate than normal tantrums. It was as if leaving the patch caused him distress, as though the soil itself called him back. The father dismissed her concerns when she finally spoke them aloud. He said the soil was loose, that raccoons or stray dogs were probably disturbing it overnight, that children often became fixated on one game before moving to another. He insisted there was nothing to worry about, but his words did not erase the image of the ground reshaping itself while the house slept. She felt certain her son was not the only one who had unsettled it. One evening, after putting her son to bed, she stepped outside with a flashlight and crouched by the patch. The beam revealed faint impressions she had not noticed before. The soil seemed pressed outward, small ridges forming a pattern that did not match her child's shovel marks. They looked almost like lines, curving gently before breaking off, as if something beneath the dirt had shifted against its covering. She touched the surface with her fingertips and felt a coolness that startled her, colder than the rest of the yard. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the thought that the ground was restless. She considered filling the hole completely, bringing in heavier soil, even planting a shrub to conceal it. But she knew, deep down, that her son would find again, and worse, She feared that covering it would not stop whatever pushed upward from beneath. In the mornings, she began studying her son's face as he crouched in the dirt. There was concentration there that seemed older than him, a seriousness out of place on a toddler's features. When she asked what he was looking for, he did not answer directly. Sometimes he murmured words she could barely catch, fragments that made no sense, or simple phrases repeated with a gravity that unsettled her. "Dig," he whispered once, patting the earth with his palm. "Open." Her husband told her she was letting her imagination run away. He said stress made small things seem larger. But she could not shake the certainty that the soil never slept, that it was not just her son who disturbed it. Each day began with the sight of him crouched low. Each night ended with her smoothing the earth back into place. And always by dawn, the ground seemed to breathe again, shifting in ways no child could manage alone. He tried to treat it lightly. Whenever his wife raised her voice in worry about the boys digging, he waved it off with a smile, telling her that kids were strange creatures and that obsessions came and went like the weather. At dinner, he even made jokes about their son's future, suggesting that maybe they had a little archaeologist in the making, or that one day he'd be famous for discovering something in their own backyard. He spoke these things as if they were harmless possibilities, but his laughter often rang hollow even to his own ears. What unsettled him was not the act of digging itself, but the way the boy went about it. There was no wandering, no distraction, no playful messiness like other children his age. Each morning the boy seemed to wake with a purpose already formed. He would tug at the back door before breakfast, plastic shovel in hand, waiting until one of them opened the way. Once outside, he crossed the yard in a straight line to that single patch of soil, and then he bent to his task with a seriousness that felt far too deliberate for a child barely 2 years old. The father often stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the small figure crouched at the far edge of the yard. He wanted to believe it was just an odd game, that soon enough the boy would tire of it and move on. But the days stretched into weeks, and still the ritual never changed. The sound of the shovel scraping against dirt became as much a part of their mornings as the hum of the refrigerator or the clatter of plates. It was steady, rhythmic, almost purposeful. When neighbors teased about the child fixation, he laughed with them. He called back light-hearted remarks, telling them not to worry, that maybe the boy was digging for treasure. But later, when the yard was empty and the laughter of others no longer shielded him, he would walk to the spot himself. The soil felt strange beneath his shoes, softer than the rest of the lawn, as though constantly turned over from within. Sometimes he crouched to touch it, pressing his palm against the earth. It seemed cooler than it should have been, damp even on days when the sun had baked the rest of the ground dry. He began to notice the silence more than anything else. Most toddlers fill their play with sounds, murmurs babbling, occasional squeals of laughter. But his son said nothing when he dug. He worked quietly, methodically, pausing now and then to brush aside a stone or root before continuing. There was a gravity in the child's posture that unnerved him, a focus too sharp for one so young. Even when he called his name, the boy often failed to respond at once, as though whatever held his attention beneath the soil was stronger than the voice of his own father. At night, when his wife expressed her fear that the ground seemed disturbed even after she smoothed it over, he dismissed it kindly but firmly. He told her raccoons or stray cats must be wandering through, that the soil was loose and easily shifted, that she was imagining patterns where none existed. He said these things because he wanted to believe them himself. But in the privacy of his own thoughts, he admitted that the explanations did not quite fit. He had seen the soil pushed outward once, ridges forming that did not look like marks from a child's shovel. He had noticed how the dog avoided the patch, circling wide around it as if something unsettled it too. Still, he clung to his skepticism, the alternative. That something lay beneath, something his son alone seemed drawn to, was not a thought he wanted to follow. He had spent too many years working long hours, paying bills, keeping their lives steady to indulge in vague fears. The world was supposed to be solid, explainable, without mysteries lurking under backyards. And yet, when he closed the door at night and tried to sleep, the sound of scraping earth often lingered in his mind. He would picture his son bent low, small hands working with a strange patience, and the unease he buried during the day crept back into him with each passing hour. He told himself it was only a matter of time before the boy grew bored. But each morning proved him wrong. The shovel struck soil again and again in the same place, and the silence around it grew heavier, more insistent, until even his own disbelief began to feel like a fragile shield against something he did not yet understand. It began subtly, almost too small to notice at first. The mother saw a thin, rangy dog nosing around the fence line one afternoon while she was pulling laundry from a line. It lingered near the far end of the yard, muzzle pressed to the ground, tail low, sniffing with the kind of concentration animals show when they sense something hidden. She clapped her hands, shooing it away, and thought little of it. Strays were not uncommon in the neighborhood, and she assumed it had followed a scent from garbage cans down the street. But the next day there was another, a different dog this time, hovering near the same corner of the yard where their son dug every morning. The boy, intent on his patch of earth, seemed not to notice. He crouched low, shovel in hand, scraping as he always did. The dog circled a few feet away, whining softly, ears flattened, before retreating when the mother stepped onto the porch. She told herself it was nothing, yet the sight unsettled her. When she mentioned it to her husband later, he shrugged and said dogs were curious by nature. Still, she found herself checking the yard more often, scanning the fence line for movement. Within a week, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Different strays appeared on different days, thin shapes weaving between yards, paws at the same spot as if drawn by a scent no human could detect. Sometimes they pawed at the soil, leaving faint scratches just beyond the boy's little hole. Other times they simply stood with heads bowed low, sniffing at the ground before slipping away. The family dog, usually bold, began avoiding the patch altogether, choosing instead to linger near the porch or inside the house. Neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Klein remarked one morning that a pack of dogs had been roaming the street the night before, their howls rising and falling in the darkness. The Johnsons complained about paw prints pressed into their flower beds. More than once, the parents awoke to the sound of claws scratching faintly at the back fence, the scrape echoing just enough to keep them awake. The boy, however, never seemed disturbed. He woke each morning as eager as ever, pointing toward the back door, demanding to resume his digging. The tension grew sharper one evening near the end of the month. Dusk had fallen, and the father sat in the living room while the mother tidied the kitchen. Their son had been put to bed, the house unusually quiet. Then came the noise, barking, frantic and sharp, cutting to the night air with such force that the dishes rattled in her hands. She froze, listening. The barking was not distant. It came from their yard. The father was at the back door in an instant, pulling it open to find two large dogs clawing at the soil where their son spent each day. Their bodies were lean, ribs showing beneath patchy fur, eyes glowing in the porch light. They barked and growled, pawing furiously at the ground, sending clumps of soil flying behind them. It was not the casual curiosity of strays. It was desperation, almost frenzy, as though they sensed something just beyond their reach. He shouted, stepping onto the porch, clapping his hands and stomping the boards. The dogs paused only briefly, teeth bared, before returning to their furious digging. The mother appeared behind him, fear tightening her voice as she urged him back inside, but he grabbed the broom propped against the wall and advanced, striking the porch railing to make a louder noise. At last the dogs retreated, hackles raised, slipping through a gap in the fence with a final snarl. Silence fell heavily afterward. The patch of earth was more torn than ever, ridges and furrows gouged deep by the dog's paws. The father stood staring, chest heaving, while the mother clutched his arm. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then, almost in unison, they looked toward the darkened window of their son's bedroom. He had not woken, or if he had made no sound. They filled the torn ground back and before bed, working under the dim beam of a flashlight. But the act fell hollow. The soil shifted loosely beneath their hands, and both parents sensed it would not stay that way for long. Later, lying awake in the dark, the mother whispered what had been growing in her mind for weeks, that animals knew things humans did not, that something in the ground was calling to them just as it called to their son. The father gave no reply. He did not want to admit that he had thought the same thing as he watched those dogs dig, their frenzy far beyond hunger or habit. From that night forward, the yard no longer felt safe. Each bark in the distance set them on edge. Each morning they looked out the window, half expecting to see the patch of soil torn open again. And though they told themselves it was only strays, only coincidence, neither could quite silence the thought that the ground itself had drawn the animals just as surely as it had captured the unwavering focus of their child. It happened on a morning that began like all the others, with the boy tugging at the back door before his parents had even finished their coffee. The air was damp from an overnight rain, the grass heavy with droplets, but he paid no mind to the wetness soaking his shoes. He hurried to his usual patch, shovel clutched in one hand, determination fixed in his small face. His mother followed him out, intending only to keep watch, but she lingered on the porch, rubbing her arms against the chill, her eyes drawn as always to the disturbed soil. The boy set to work quickly, scooping aside the loosened earth with more precision than clumsy play should allow. His little hands dug deeper, the shovel scraping, pushing the soil aside in neat piles. Minutes stretched into half an hour. Then, suddenly, he froze. His shovel had struck something that gave a faint, hollow sound. He crouched lower, using his fingers now, brushing dirt away with an intensity that made his mother's chest tighten. A moment later, he pulled something from the ground and stood, holding it aloft with both hands. She stepped down from the porch instinctively, her heart picking up speed. The object in his hands was small, about the size of his palm, metallic and dull. At first glance, it looked like a corroded piece of junk, perhaps a scrap of rusted hardware left buried in the soil for decades. But when he toddled toward her, face shining with the pride of discovery, and placed it in her hand, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The weight of the thing was wrong. It was heavier than it should have been, dense as if made of an alloy no longer common. Its surface, though scarred with rust and age, bore patterns she could not dismiss as random corrosion. There were grooves cut deliberately, faint shapes pressed into the metal. She brushed dirt away with her thumb, revealing a design that seemed both geometric and unfamiliar, as though intended to carry meaning, but not in any language she recognized. Her husband, who had been inside at the time, came out when he heard her call. She showed him the object, holding it gingerly between her fingers. He chuckled at first, suggesting it might be an old tool fragment or a piece of machinery, the kind of thing that could easily be left behind by builders decades ago. Yet as he turned it over in his hand, his amusement faltered. The markings were too precise, too deliberate. They both crouched in the grass, examining it closely. Along one edge was what looked like a faint circle, half lost to corrosion, with smaller lines radiating outward like spokes. Elsewhere were ridges that might once have formed letters or symbols, though worn down beyond recognition. It was not modern. It did not resemble any household item, nor any discarded scrap one might expect to find in a yard that had seen nearly a century of habitation. The boy stood quietly beside them, watching, his shovel dangling loosely from one hand. He did not laugh or babble, as toddlers usually did when they wanted attention. Instead, he waited, his wide eyes fixed on the object in his mother's hand, as though he knew it was meant to be given to her and no one else. For the rest of that day, the object sat on the kitchen table, resting on a dish towel where the mother had placed it. She found herself staring at it often, pausing while cooking or folding laundry to glance at the dull metal surface. The father tried to wave it away, saying they could take it to a local appraiser or museum if it seemed unusual. But even he kept circling back to the table, picking it up and then setting it down again, unease flickering across his face. By evening, as they put their son to bed, the mother could not shake the sense that the object had been waiting, buried in the soil for years, untouched by anyone who had lived in the house before them, revealed not by chance but by the persistence of a child too young to understand why he had chosen that exact spot. She wondered if it was simply the imagination of a worried parent, layering meaning onto coincidence. But each time she traced the patterns with her fingertip, she felt the same certainty pressing against her. This was not random scrap. It had been made for a purpose, one that time had hidden but not erased. And through it all, her son had remained strangely calm, as if satisfied by the day's work. For once, he had not cried when brought inside. He had not struggled to return to the yard. It was as though, Having delivered the object into her hands, his task was complete. For now, the discovery of the metal object lingered in the back of their minds, heavy in a way that simple curiosity could not explain. For days, it sat on the kitchen counter wrapped in a towel, as if the cloth could soften its presence. The mother found herself tracing its markings in quiet moments, her fingers pausing at the ridges and faded symbols that seemed to resist explanation. The father tried to ignore it, though every time he passed the table, his eyes drifted toward the dull gleam of corroded metal. Their son seemed content, calmer even, as though uncovering the object had granted him temporary relief from the relentless need to dig. But both parents knew it would not last. It was the mother who first suggested they look into the land's history, the stories they had heard from neighbors, of the reclusive Haldane family, of unexplained vanishings, were vague, handed down through decades of whispers. She wanted something more concrete, something that might explain how a child could find an artifact buried so precisely in the same patch of earth he had obsessed over for weeks. The father resisted at first, dismissing it as unnecessary. But late one night, as he sat with the object in his hand, feeling its unnatural weight, he admitted that the question had been gnawing at him too. A week later, they found themselves at the county archive, a brick building with shelves that smelled of dust and paper left too long in the dark. The mother requested records on their lot, tracing the property deeds backward through time. What she uncovered made her stomach tighten. Their modest suburban parcel had not always been so small. In the late 19th century, the land had formed part of sprawling property owned by a man named Elias Croft, a railroad foreman whose name appeared again and again in local registers of the 1880s. Croft had been no ordinary laborer. Records describe him as a man trusted with overseeing the transport of wages, heavy chests of cash and coin that traveled along the newly built lines to pay workers scattered across the state. Such responsibility made him both respected and resented. Rumors, preserved in yellow clippings and faded journals, suggested that on more than one occasion, a chest had gone missing under his watch. Official accounts often blamed bandits, accidents, or bookkeeping errors. But the stories passed between workers painted a darker picture. They spoke of payrolls that vanished without trace, of wagons that left stations never to arrive at their destinations, of men who asked too many questions and were never seen again. The family history section contained a brief mention of Croft's estate. Built hastily, the property stretched across fields and woodlands that were later carved into smaller parcels as the decades passed. The house, larger and more imposing than most of its time, was said to host gatherings where business was conducted behind closed doors. By the early 1900s, the estate was fractured, sold off in pieces. Records noted disputes, lawsuits over boundaries and inheritance, though the outcomes were rarely clear. More unsettling were the small-town rumors preserved in a thin, self-published history written by a local amateur historian in the 1950s. In those pages, the Croft property was described as cursed ground. The book claimed that several workers were buried hastily after an accident near the rail yard Croft oversaw, but that the families were never told where. Whispers suggested the dead had been brought back to the estate itself, buried quickly and quietly to avoid questions. Other stories spoke of Croft himself hiding payroll chests on the property during a wave of robberies, intending to recover them later, but never succeeding. By the time his family sold the estate, no one knew what remained buried under its soil. The mother read aloud from the faded text, her voice low in the quiet of the archive room. The words made the father shift uncomfortably in his chair. He insisted that much of it was folklore, exaggerated over time by locals who enjoyed dark tales. Yet when she reminded him of the metallic object their son had unearthed, and the strange markings pressed into its surface, his protest fell into silence. They left the archive with photocopies of deeds, maps, and the historian's book. That evening, spread across their dining table, the papers seemed to transform their house into something different. What they had thought of as an ordinary suburban home was now revealed to be part of a forgotten lot once charged with secrets. Their backyard, the very patch of soil their son had chosen, lay directly along one of the old boundary lines that had shifted again and again in the disputes following Croft's death. The land was fractured not only in ownership but in memory, carried with it unresolved stories of wealth gone missing and lives cut short. The father stared at the maps, tracing the outlines with his finger. "Even if some of this is true," he said finally, "it doesn't explain why he knew where to dig." His wife had no answer. She only looked toward the small bedroom down the hall, where their son lay sleeping, his hands curled in the blankets. She thought of him crouched over the dirt, silent and intent, as if guided by something neither of them could see. The first night it happened, they thought it was only a bad dream. The boy stirred in his crib just after midnight, a muffled whimper that rose into sharp cries. His mother rushed in, expecting to find him tangled in his blanket or frightened by shadows. Instead, he sat upright, his small arms stretched stiffly toward the window, his finger pointed to the glass at the backyard. His eyes, wide and glistening with tears, did not waver. He was not looking at her. He was staring past her, at the patch of earth where he had spent so many days digging. She tried to soothe him, lifting him into her arms and rocking him against her chest, whispering comfort into his hair. But even as his sobs softened, his tiny hand kept lifting, pointing insistently at the window. His gaze remained fixed on the darkness outside. She closed the curtains, hoping it would help, but he thrashed until she pulled them back open again. Only when she allowed him to watch the yard, his face pressed against the glass, did his breathing steady. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him, and he fell asleep in her arms, his fingers still curled as if unwilling to stop pointing. The next night, it happened again. This time his cries came earlier, and when she entered, she found him already standing in his crib, his small hand stretched toward the window, as if the gesture had become instinct. She tried turning on a lamp, then the overhead light, but neither seemed to matter. His attention never strayed from that same spot in the yard. The soil looked no different than before, smoothed over in the day, yet somehow alive in the night with a weight that unsettled her. By the third night, she could no longer dismiss it. She began leaving lights on through the house, creating a dim glow that spilled across the yard. She sat with her son in the rocking chair, both of them facing the window, watching shadows lengthen and recede with the swaying of the trees. At times, she thought she saw a movement where none should have been, a ripple in the soil, the faint shift of grass stirred by no wind. The boy seemed to notice it too, his little body tensing against her arms whenever the darkness appeared to shift. The father, at first, tried to downplay the strangeness. He insisted that children often woke at night, their minds tangled with dreams too vivid to distinguish from reality. But even as he spoke, his own restlessness betrayed him. He began sleeping on the couch in the living room, from where he could see the yard through the sliding glass doors. He told himself it was only to reassure his wife, to prove that nothing was there. Yet he found himself staring out for hours, the flickering glow of the porch light barely cutting into the shadows. The noises began soon after. At first, it was only the faintest scrape, like an animal pawing lightly at the dirt. Then came heavier sounds, a muted thud, as though weight shifted beneath the ground, followed by a silence too deliberate to be natural. He rose more than once, stepping out barefoot onto the deck, straining to hear, the night air pressing cold against his skin, carrying no wind, no rustle of branches, only the weight of silence broken by those unnatural disturbances in the soil. The dogs returned, too, drawn again to the same patch of earth. One evening, just past midnight, their barking erupted without warning, sharp and frantic at the fence line. By the time he reached the back door, the animals were clawing against the boards. Their attention, fixed on the spot his son, had been pointing to night after night. When he shouted and clapped his hands, they scattered, but not before leaving shallow scrapes in the wood, where their nails had torn into it. The boy's nightly ritual became unbearable. His mother began to dread the clock inching toward midnight, knowing that the cries would soon pierce the quiet of the house. She found herself rising before he could, standing at the window first, searching the yard with tired eyes, hoping that she could intercept whatever drew him there. Yet she never saw enough to name it, only the shifting unease that clung to soil like a shadow no light could dispel. The father, once dismissive, could no longer laugh it off. He confessed to hearing the noises even when he lay half awake on the couch, a dull rhythm like digging from below, faint but deliberate. He could not explain it, nor could he face admitting to his wife that he had considered staying awake all night just to watch. The yard, once a harmless space for their child's play, had become something else, an unspoken presence that demanded their attention night after night. They began to wonder, quietly and separately, what lay beneath the ground their son refused to ignore. Neither voiced the thought fully, but each carried it, heavy and unrelenting, as the sleepless night stretched on. The boy had stopped crying once the lights were kept on, but he never stopped pointing. And in the stillness of those hours, when exhaustion blurred the edges of reason, both parents felt the same quiet dread, that the child was not pointing at shadows, but at something waiting beneath the earth. It was a Saturday morning when they finally gave in to the weight of their own unease. The mother had been awake most of the night, pacing the living room while her husband tried to reassure her from couch. Their son had gone to sleep clutching his toy shovel, as though he feared someone might take it away. When the sun rose and spilled its pale light into the yard, she stood at the window and whispered that she could not bear to wonder anymore. The father, though reluctant, found himself nodding. The sleepless nights, the noises, the way the soil seemed to shift back into disturbance no matter how carefully it was smoothed. There was no pretending it away. They waited until their son had wandered inside with his toys before gathering what they needed. The father carried a real shovel from the garage, its metal edge dulled with rust from years of disuse. The mother followed with a small gardening spade, her hands already trembling. They approached the patch of earth that had become the center of their lives, the patch their boy had treated as if it held the most important secret in the world. For a moment, neither moved. They just stared at the ground. The grass thinner here, the soil darker, as if marked by invisible hands. The first thrust of the shovel was hesitant. The father pressed down with his foot, breaking the surface with a sharp crunch of compacted dirt. The smell that rose was damp, earthy, tinged with something older, something that seemed to carry a weight of years. He dug again, each motion cutting deeper, his wife crouching nearby to clear away loosened soil with her smaller spade. They worked in silence, the sound of metal striking earth filling the air. It did not take long, no more than a foot, maybe less, before the shovel struck something that was not soil. A hollow thud reverberated up the handle, startling him enough that he paused. He scraped carefully, exposing fragments beneath the dirt. The mother reached in with her hand, brushing away clumps until the shape revealed itself. Wood. Not rotten or splintering as one would expect, but dense and dark, its surface unnaturally intact for something buried so long. The boards lay tightly pressed together, compact as though deliberately fashioned. They exchanged a look, unease etched in both faces. The father knelt and tapped the surface lightly with the shovel's edge. The sound was muted but firm, not the fragile crumble of old wood, but something sealed, preserved against time. The mother touched it with her fingertips, surprised at the smoothness beneath the grit. It was not like debris or discarded planks. It felt deliberate, constructed. He cleared more earth, following the lines of the boards, until their arrangement became clear. They did not scatter randomly in the soil, but joined at edges, forming a continuous surface, as though part of a larger lid. She whispered the word without meaning to, "A box." He did not answer, but his silence carried the same thought. The air seemed heavier around them. The neighborhood noises, the faint hum of traffic, the call of a bird, receded until all that remained was the steady rhythm of their breathing. Each scrape of soil revealed more of the dark wood, spreading outward like the edges of something hidden deliberately from sight. Their son toddled back outside at one point, clutching his plastic shovel, and stood at the edge of the hole. His wide eyes seemed to recognize the shape before they did. He pointed with his little hand, just as he had pointed night after night, his expression calm now, almost expectant. The father told him gently to go back inside, but the boy did not move. He just watched, silent and unwavering. The mother felt a shiver at the back of her neck, as though her child were less a participant now than a witness. They dug until the edges stretched several feet across, each board pressed tightly against the other. The soil clung damply to the surface, but even with the earth stripped away, the wood remained sealed, resistant to decay. The father tried wedging the tip of his shovel into the seam, but the boards did not give. They seemed locked in place, as though guarding whatever lay beneath. By mid-afternoon, their hands ached. Their clothes were smeared with soil, yet the discovery remained stubbornly closed. The hole was shallow, But its presence transformed the yard. No longer just a patch of disturbed earth. It now framed something tangible, something unmistakably intentional. The mother stared down at it, her breath catching in her throat. She whispered again that it was a lid, not debris, not accident. Something beneath had been sealed away. The father stood, wiping sweat from his brow, his expression tight. He told her they should stop for the day, that they needed to think before going further. But his tone lacked conviction. They both knew that once the first layer of earth had been broken, once the wood had been revealed, there was no turning back. The yard could never again be just a yard. The soil had offered up a secret, and now it demanded an answer. That night, they did not speak of what they had found, but neither slept. The image of the dark boards lingered behind their closed eyes, a lid waiting, patient and heavy, for the moment it would be forced open. The following morning brought no relief from the weight of discovery. The family avoided mentioning it over breakfast, yet their minds hovered around the same unspoken thought. Their son, however, seemed to remember perfectly. He waddled toward the window as soon as the meal was finished, his toy shovel in hand, and pressed his face against the glass to look out at the disturbed earth. The parents exchanged a glance, and after a long pause, the father sighed. They could not leave it half uncovered, exposed like a wound in the yard. If it had been buried deliberately, it would not remain patient forever. They returned to the site with tools in hand. The soil, still damp from yesterday's digging, gave way easily as they cleared the rest of the wooden surface. It stretched wider than either of them had expected, nearly 3 feet long and 2 across, its surface flat and dark. At one corner, where the boards met, the father's shovel scraped against metal with sharp ring. He leaned closer, brushing away the dirt with his hand, until the shape revealed itself. An iron band, rusted but intact, ran across the wood, holding it firmly. Another band appeared at the opposite edge, then another, circling the entire structure. It was no mere box hastily assembled. It had been crafted with precision, bound in metal to last. The father crouched and pressed his hands against the surface, testing its weight. Even with much of the soil cleared away, it resisted his attempt to shift it. The mother joined him, and together they tried to lift it from the earth. It did not budge. The ground seemed to hold it, as though it belonged more to the soil than to the hands that unearthed it. At last, with a groan of effort, they managed to tilt it slightly upward, just enough to reveal its bulk. Beneath the lid, the sides extended downward, thick planks forming a chest sunk deep into the ground. It was not small, not the kind of keepsake box one might hide in a garden, but something made to contain weight, something meant to endure time. Their arms trembled as they lowered it back into place. The mother knelt closer, her hand hovering above the seam where lid met wall. A faint odor rose from the narrow cracks, damp, earthy, edged with a hint of rot that was neither fresh nor entirely gone. It was the smell of something kept from air for too long, of age pressing against iron and wood. She pulled her hand back instinctively, her face pale. The father fetched a hammer and chisel from the garage, determined to force one of the iron bands loose. He wedged the chisel into a seam and struck it with a hammer. The blow rang through the yard, metallic and hollow, startling the birds from a fence. The band rattled but held, the rust clinging stubbornly. He struck again, harder, until flakes of corroded iron cracked away, scattering like brittle shells. A narrow gap opened between the metal and the wood, releasing another breath of air from within. This time the odor was sharper, mustier, carrying with a suggestion that turned their stomachs. The boy, who had been watching quietly from the porch, clapped his hands as though urging them to continue. His eyes were wide, not fearful but intent, as though this moment was what he had been waiting for. The father hesitated, sweat dampening his brow. He glanced at his wife, who shook her head faintly, her voice low and uncertain. Maybe they should stop. Maybe they should call someone, anyone, before prying further. But the box seemed to command otherwise, its presence demanding resolution. He struck again, loosening more of the band until it sagged at one corner. With final effort, he wrenched it free, tossing the twisted length of iron into the dirt. They worked at the other bands, piece by piece, until the chest was bare of its bindings. What remained was a wood, still intact though scarred with the marks of rusted metal. The mother pressed her palms against the lid. It was solid beneath her hands, smooth in some places, ridged in others where time had left its imprint. She leaned closer, listening, as though expecting to hear something stir within. But there was only silence, deep and steady, the silence of something long entombed. They tried again to lift the lid, but the wood resisted, swollen from dampness, wedged tightly against his frame. The father fetched a crowbar, slipping it into the seam, and leaned his weight into it. The wood groaned in protest, fibers straining, until at last the lid shifted a fraction of an inch. From that narrow opening, a stronger wave of odor escaped, heavy and suffocating. The smell of time itself pressed into darkness. The mother gagged and pulled back, covered her mouth with her sleeve. They stopped then, trembling from exertion and from the weight of what they had begun. The box, once hidden beneath their child-persistent digging, now lay fully unearthed, its bands broken, its secret on the verge of release. The air around it felt changed, as though charged with something that did not belong to the present day. Their son toddled closer, peering into the narrow gap with strange calm, his little hand resting on the edge of the wood. The parents stared down at the sealed chest, hearts pounding, knowing they stood at the threshold of something they could no longer ignore. It was no longer just their child's obsession, no longer just an oddity buried in their yard. It was a box deliberately bound, deliberately hidden, and now, inevitably, about to speak its truth. The crowbar finally gave way with a sound that sent shivers through the yard, a splitting groan as if the earth itself were objecting. The lid wrenched upward, cracking at the swollen seams, until at last it lifted enough for the father to shove it back. The stench that escaped was immediate and consuming, a sour mix of mildew, damp wood, and something acrid that spoke of decades sealed away. Both parents staggered back, covering their mouths, eyes watering. For a moment they considered shutting it again, pushing the lid back into place, burying the box as though nothing had been uncovered. But the sight inside rooted them to the spot. At the top lay folds of fabric, once fine but now fragile, their threads brittle with age. The cloth had been white once, or cream, but time had darkened it into shades of gray and yellow, its edges eaten through by insects or decay. The mother reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing one corner. It crumbled beneath her touch, flaking into dust like ash. She snatched her hand back, startled by how quickly something meant to endure could fall apart with the slightest disturbance. Beneath the cloth, half hidden, were smaller shapes. The father leaned in, using the end of the crowbar to nudge aside the ruined fabric, unwilling to touch it directly. The wood at the bottom of the chest was lined with items that had been arranged with purpose. There were documents, their paper faded to brown, edges curled and fragile. Some bore seals in wax, cracked but still faintly visible. Others were tied in bundles with string so thin it had nearly disintegrated. The writing, where legible, was dense and formal. Ink bled into fibers with the passing of decades. Among the papers lay pieces of jewelry, dull by tarnish yet unmistakable in form. A chain of silver, its links darkened, ended in a pendant shaped like a cross, but worked with odd, unfamiliar detailing. A pair of earrings, their settings holding stones cloudy with age, glinted faintly when touched by sunlight. The mother stared at them, struck by how these objects, once meant to be worn proudly, now seemed like remnants of lives reduced to silence. At the center of it all was something wrapped carefully in oilskin, the material darkened with age yet still protecting what it concealed. The bundle was heavy when the father lifted it out, heavier than its size suggested. The skin was stiff, reluctant to unfold, but he worked at it carefully until the layers peeled back. Inside was an object that caught the light in strange ways, a small box within the larger chest. Its surface carved with markings that were not decorative so much as deliberate, as though they were symbols meant to convey something. The mother drew closer, her brow furrowed. She reached out to touch the carvings, tracing their lines with hesitant fingers. They were worn but still sharp in places, etched deeply enough to survive. She could not place their origin, but they felt old, older than the house, older than the property. She pulled her hand back quickly, her pulse quickening. There was a sensation that the object did not want to be touched. They placed it carefully on the grass beside the chest. The boy, who had been silent, shuffled closer, his eyes fixed on it. He crouched down, his tiny hands hovering over the carvings, as if he understood something his parents did not. The father reached to pull him back, but before he could, the boy pressed his palm flat against the box. For a moment, nothing happened. Just a faint chirping of birds in the distance and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Then the child looked up at his parents with an expression that was both innocent and unsettling, as though he had found what he had been searching for all along. The parents exchanged a look, their unease deepening. What they had uncovered was not treasure in any sense they could embrace. It felt like intrusion, like pulling back the veil on something that had never been meant for them to see. The documents, the jewelry, the carved box, none of it gave the thrill of discovery, only the weight of trespassing into a story that was not theirs. The mother began gathering the loose cloth pieces, folding them as gently as she could despite their fragility. The father tried to organize the papers without destroying them further, though the effort seemed hopeless. Every touch risked another fragment breaking away. The oilskin wrappings lay beside them, stiff and stained, and with them the heavy silence of things deliberately hidden. The evening grew colder as they lingered by the chest, unable to decide what to do next. To leave it open felt wrong, disrespectful, but to seal it again seemed equally impossible now that its contents had been exposed. Their son sat cross-legged on the grass, staring at the small carved box as though it held his entire attention. His parents tried not to notice how calm he looked, how purposeful, while they themselves felt only dread. The objects inside were not riches, not gold or jewels to bring fortune, but they were something older, something heavier. The family knew instinctively that whatever story lay beneath their yard was not one of wealth, but of secrecy, of something hidden not to be found but to be forgotten. And yet, it was now in their hands, undeniable, waiting to speak in whatever language time had given it. The call to the authorities was made reluctantly, with long pauses and halting words. The father held the phone as though it were heavier than the box itself, describing in vague terms what they had found without quite knowing how to explain it. He avoided words like treasure or artifact, settling instead on something buried, old and unusual. Within an hour, a patrol car rolled up to the curb, its presence immediately drawing the eyes of neighbors who peered through curtains or stepped onto porches. The parents led the officers into the backyard, where the open chest sat exposed under the dimming sky. The officers circled it with guarded expressions. One bent low to peer inside, but did not touch anything. Another took notes, his eyes flicking between the box, the scattered documents, and the small carved container that sat on the grass. The boy watched from the porch steps, silent and watchful, while his parents tried to answer questions that felt impossibly large. Who had owned the property before? How had the box come to be buried? Why had they chosen to dig there at all? Every answer seemed to raise more questions, and the officers themselves offered none in return. Soon after, a second vehicle arrived, this time unmarked, and from it stepped an older man in plain clothes who introduced himself as part of the local historical society. His arrival shifted the tone of the scene. Where the officers kept their distance, he leaned close, his gloved hands hovering just above the artifacts. He examined the documents with narrowed eyes, murmuring about the fragility of the paper and the preservation of the seals. When he reached the jewelry, he paused, tilting a pendant in the fading light, remarking that its design was unlike the typical pieces of the region's late 19th century. It was the oilskin-wrapped box that captured him most. He studied the carvings without speaking for several minutes, his expression unreadable. At last, he muttered something about dates, about incidents long forgotten, except in the archives. He requested that everything remain untouched until a proper team could arrive, specialists who could catalog and preserve the find. By morning, word had already spread through the town. Neighbors lingered at fences and sidewalks, their voices lowered but their curiosity unmistakable. Stories circulated faster than the facts. That a treasure had been uncovered, that bones had been found, that the yard itself was cursed. The truth was less sensational, but no less unsettling. The Historical Society confirmed that the box bore resemblance to descriptions in old police reports, descriptions tied to the disappearance of a family in 1892 whose case had never been solved. According to fragments in the county's archives, a railroad foreman named Ezra Caldwell had gone missing with his wife and daughter. Their home was searched, Their accounts emptied, their land eventually divided and sold. Rumors of theft and violence spread, but nothing was ever proven. The records noted missing payroll chests belonging to the railroad, disputes with workers, and whispers of retribution. Over the years, the story faded into little more than a ghost tale told by school children. Until now, the parents listened as these connections were laid out in the living room, their son tucked in bed upstairs. They sat rigid, barely speaking, as the historian explained how the jewelry matched family records, how the documents bore signatures consistent with Caldwell's hand, and how the smaller card box might have been intended to safeguard something of significance, whether money, deeds, or perhaps evidence of betrayal. He could not say for certain, but his conviction was clear. The objects were not random refuse, but part of a larger story that had ended in mystery. The police, meanwhile, grew cautious. Detectives asked pointed questions about the child's role, about why he had dug there, about whether the ground had been disturbed before. The mother insisted again and again that it had been their son's fixation alone, a 2-year-old's inexplicable persistence that had led to the discovery. The officer scribbled notes, unconvinced but unable to argue with the sheer strangeness of it. As experts from the State Historical Office arrived days later, equipment and cameras in tow, the backyard transformed into something like an excavation site. The chest was lifted carefully, its contents photographed and recorded, the soil around it sifted for any further evidence. Each step drew more attention, and soon reporters appeared at the street, held back by tape but eager for a story. Their voices carried over the fence, asking about treasure, about hauntings, about a case unsolved for more than a century. The parents tried to shield their son from the attention, but even at his young age, he seemed to understand the gravity of what had been uncovered. He sat at the window, small hands pressed to the glass, watching strangers move through his yard as though they had always belonged there. At times, he seemed content, even pleased, as though he had simply finished the work he had been meant to do. For the parents, there was no such peace. The involvement of authorities brought questions they had never thought to face, about history, about ownership, about what it meant to live atop a story that had been deliberately buried. Their quiet suburban home had become the center of an inquiry stretching back generations, and nothing about their lives felt ordinary anymore. The earth beneath their child's favorite spot had spoken, and now the world was listening. The change came suddenly, so abrupt it unsettled the parents more than the weeks of obsession that had preceded it. For months their mornings had followed the same pattern. A small figure in pajamas pulling on boots too large for his feet, clutching plastic shovels and heading straight to that patch of earth as though called by something no one else could hear. But one morning he didn't. He walked past the door without glancing at the yard, sat on the floor beside his toys, and quietly pushed the car back and forth as if the patch of ground had never existed. At first, they welcomed the break. The mother felt a strange relief in seeing him finally occupied with something normal, relieved that she could drink her coffee without watching the small hand scratch endlessly at the dirt. The father joked that their son had moved on to other obsessions, as children often do. Yet the relief did not last. By the second day, the change no longer felt like childhood whimsy. The boy refused even to step onto grass, his little frame stiffening if led toward the back door. When the father tried to coax him outside, he shook his head fiercely, eyes wide, clutching his mother's hand as if afraid of being pulled away. The silence that settled in him was unnatural. He had never been a talkative child, but now he would not speak of the yard at all. If asked about the digging, he turned his head, refusing eye contact, retreating into a stubborn quiet that seemed older than his years. The mother pressed him gently, hoping for some explanation, even a child's broken sentence to frame his change of heart. Instead, she received only silence, the kind that seemed too knowing, too deliberate. Nights became more difficult. The boy woke less frequently in terror, yet the peace was hollow. He often stirred restlessly, muttering half-formed words, though never those his parents could clearly understand. The window overlooking the yard remained covered now, the curtains pulled tight, but sometimes he would rise and press his palms against the fabric, as if making sure nothing outside could see him. In the morning, he returned to his toys without comment, but his eyes betrayed something unsettled, something left unspoken. The parents felt a divide opening between themselves as well. The father clung to skepticism, reminding his wife that children are unpredictable, their fixations fleeting. He insisted the boy's silence meant nothing more than a natural shift of attention, but the mother could not shake her unease. She remembered too vividly the way the soil seemed disturbed even after she had smoothed it flat, the way the box had been unearthed exactly where her son had dug without fail. For her, the silence was not dismissal but avoidance, as though their child knew too much and wanted no part in it anymore. The involvement of authorities had only deepened the strangeness. With each visit from the Historical Society or the quiet questions from police detectives, the mother noticed how her son withdrew further. He refused to go near the windows when officials stepped into the yard, hiding instead behind furniture or clinging to her skirt. Once, when an officer knelt to greet him gently, the boy turned away without a word, shaking his head with small, deliberate defiance. It was not shyness. It was refusal. Questions circled without answers. How had he known to dig in that precise spot? Why had he persisted so long, never distracted, never curious about other corners of the yard? And why now had he severed his connection so abruptly, as if the discovery had ended something for him? The parents wondered aloud if perhaps children could sense what adults could not, if he had been following a pull he could never explain. And now that the secret had surfaced, the pull was gone. The house itself felt different after the child abandoned the yard. The silence seemed to spread beyond him, seeping into evenings where conversation faltered and the weight of the past pressed heavier. The box was gone now, taken by officials, but the ground remained, a scarred, disturbed soil at the center of their lawn. Each time the parents passed it, they felt the boy's absence, his sudden refusal to return to the spot that had once consumed him. Neighbors asked questions still, some curious, others suspicious, but the family offered no real answers. They could not explain why their toddler had dug with such determination, nor why he had stopped without warning. Even among themselves, they struggled to speak of it. The father dismissed it when he could, though unease lingered in his quiet moments. The mother, however, grew convinced the child had known something from the start, something neither of them had the language to name. The boy remained silent. Weeks turned to months, and the spot grew over again, grass stretching thinly across the scar. But he never stepped near it, never allowed his toys to cross its boundary. Even as his interests shifted to blocks, to drawings, to the ordinary preoccupations of childhood, that part of the yard was left untouched. His silence was not merely absence of words. It was a kind of finality, as if the matter was closed for him in a way his parents would never understand. For them, the haunting question persisted. How had he known where to dig? And perhaps more unsettling, why did he stop? They found themselves watching their son more closely than before, searching for glimpses of knowledge in his small, guarded expressions, wondering if the silence of a toddler could be heavier than the discoveries of history itself. The confirmation arrived not in a single dramatic announcement, but in fragments, delivered through cautious words and carefully phrased reports. Historians, after weeks of study, declared that the box and its contents could indeed be traced back to the missing household of the late 19th century, a family whose disappearance had lingered in whispers for more than a century. The jewelry matched descriptions found in old inventories. The documents bore names inked in fading script, and the oilskin wrapping protected pages of correspondence that, once unfolded, revealed the voices of people long silenced. What had once been rumor and speculation had become tangible history, drawn from the soil of the suburban yard where a toddler's hands had been compelled to dig. The town absorbed the revelation with fascination. Newspaper articles recounted the story with a mixture of wonder and unease, their headlines speaking of mystery resolved and secrets unearthed. Local historians described the find as a rare bridge between folklore and record, something that finally anchored speculation in evidence. For years, people had told stories of the vanished family, tales that blurred fact and legend, arguments over land, whispers of debts unpaid, tragedies that left houses abandoned. Now, here were objects that confirmed their existence and gave weight to their disappearance. Museums requested custody of the box. Scholars debated its significance, and residents spoke with kind of reverence about how the ordinary backyard had yielded what archives alone never could. Yet within the household that had been the center of discovery, the feeling was not triumph, but something closer to disquiet. The parents listened to experts discuss provenance and cataloging, but beneath the academic excitement lay the memory of their child's persistence. Their son, barely able to form full sentences, had returned to the same patch of earth day after day, guided by something no one else could perceive. Adults had overlooked it for generations, and yet he, in his silence and innocence, had brought it to light. The parents found no comfort in the explanations others tried to give, that it was coincidence, that children often fixate on trivial things, that curiosity had merely aligned with accident. For them, the timing, the precision, the depth of his fixation all resisted simple dismissal. They could not forget the sound of his small shovel scraping soil, the intensity with which he leaned forward as if listening, the way he worked without distraction, as though he knew with certainty what lay beneath. They could not forget how he stopped, how his silence afterward was heavier than his digging had ever been. When others asked him to describe the boy's role, they softened the details, unwilling to speak fully of what unsettled them most. They said he liked to play in the dirt, that he had stumbled across something while digging. They did not say that he had been relentless, guided, almost compelled. They did not admit that they feared he had carried knowledge no child should. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet and the excitement of scholars faded into the distance, the parents felt the weight of what had been uncovered not just in history, but in their own lives. Their yard no longer seemed like a simple patch of grass. It had become a threshold where the present touched the unresolved past. They watched their son with a mix of awe and unease, trying to reconcile his ordinary play with the extraordinary role he had played. Sometimes, when he laughed or stacked blocks or called for him in a small voice, they found themselves staring, wondering how someone so young could carry such unknowable certainty. The community celebrated the rewritten history, but for the family, the legacy was more intimate, less easily explained. Their house did not feel the same. Nights carried a residual heaviness, as though the ground itself held on to its secrets even after they had been lifted into the light. The mother caught herself glancing out at the yard, her eyes drawn back to the scar of soil that had been dug and refilled. The father, despite his skepticism, admitted to feeling uneasy walking across it, as though stepping on ground that had chosen to reveal itself only once and would not forgive intrusion again. The discovery had given their town a story, a piece of history restored, but it left their household with something more difficult. The memory of their child, too young to speak clearly, uncovering what scholars and neighbors had overlooked for generations. They lived with the quiet knowledge that history had not been uncovered by research or design, but by the persistence of a boy who seemed, for a brief time, to have been guided by something beyond them. And though the world around them treated the find as a triumph, inside their home it lingered as a mystery that would never fully let them go.